Okay, so let's move on to the positives now. Let's start to look at, we've talked about ABLE, a great program that's been used and is having success already. How can we go about creating moral rebels in our workplaces, in our schools, our universities, and in our communities? How can we do that? What's your advice?
Yeah, so I think, to me, actually the most important is understanding what leads to inaction, because in many cases people think, oh, it's just me, I'm the only one. So I give the example very regularly in group settings in which I say, who's ever been in a college classroom in which the professor said, do you have any questions? And you had a question, but you chose not to raise your hand. And you chose not to raise your hand because you didn't want to look stupid. Yes. And here's the key. You look around the room and no one else is raising their hands. So you're like, oh, it's just me and I must be dumb. And so I'm not going to raise my hand. But what's fascinating about that is when you look around at everybody else also not raising their hand, you don't think, oh, they don't want to look stupid. You think they're smart. Yeah. And so that's just a simple example. But what it illustrates is that we all think that we're unique. I'm the only one who worries about looking stupid. I'm the only one who worries about feeling embarrassed. So understanding the very normal factors as humans of being worried about looking stupid for overreacting or feeling embarrassed, understanding, oh, all these other people on the train or in the department or in the locker room are feeling the same thing. That in and of itself, that knowledge of the psychology of inaction can help give people the courage to step up, because all of a sudden they start thinking, oh, other people will be thankful if I do that. They wish I would, right? That's the key.
Yeah, it's funny because I've there's a mutual friend, Scott Allison, who's a psychology professor, and he's inspired me to dress outrageously every so often. Like just now I'm wearing bright green trousers. I've got the greenest trousers in the world, and every time I buy socks, I buy the loudest socks. And often when I'm working, people point out the socks, lovely. I tell them why, because we can all start to practice standing out, can't we? And that's how we overcome that bystander effect is really, really important. In your book, you talk about finding friends. Why are friends important for active bystanders?
Yeah, that is such an important and really timely point, because I think in many cases, people feel uncomfortable speaking out alone. That speaking out alone feels really, really hard. Having somebody else with you can all of a sudden give us a sense of greater courage and the ability to speak up. So I think one of the keys is that sometimes we can be like, oh, is it just me? If there's somebody in the setting who you can kind of run things by and be like, hey, are you seeing that? Are you, whatever. Having somebody else there can make a big difference.
Yeah, I think finding friends it just gives reassurance to that bystander, that person, to help them do the right thing. What and just coming towards the end of this, what's the importance of practice, do you think, in that for active to help active bystanders?
So I like you talk about this topic all the time, and here's what invariably will happen after I finish a radio interview or a reporter or whatever. Somebody will say to me, hey, I just want to tell you about this time. And then they'll tell me about some time in which, like, I was on a bus, I was in an airport, I was in a park, and they didn't intervene. And invariably what they say is as follows. 2 days later, I was in the shower and all of a sudden I thought of the perfect thing I should have done, the perfect thing I should have said, because they've stewed about it and they've regretted not saying it. And so the thing is that 2 days later in the shower, that's too late. That ship has sailed. Yeah. And so the key thing about practicing is that saying, okay, what could I say or do that would interrupt the situation in some way? And that could be just saying, oh, can you clarify what you mean? Or that could be assuming the person's joking. It could be saying, oh, you know what? You probably don't mean anything about it, but my sister was sexually assaulted. And so, or whatever. Having a very small moment of saying, here is how I can interrupt this moment, interrupt this scene. Playing that through in your mind can then mean that you don't have to wait till 2 days later in the shower to come up with the perfect response, because you've played through what you're going to do.
Yeah, I remember years ago speaking to a head teacher in a school in Scotland, and she said to me, we were starting some bystander training in the school, and at the end of it, she was a little bit hesitant about the training, not because she was scared about putting her kids at risk. More, she said to me, Graham, you're just making my children feel guilty if they don't intervene. And I said to her, quick as a flash, I said, my experience suggests that a lot of young people feel guilty anyway when they don't help. And they see a friend who's being a victim of bullying. And, one thing I've learned recently is that if you're a victim of bullying or abuse in a workplace or school, and someone comes and speaks to you, even after the abuse, and says something to you, are you okay? That wasn't your fault. That can lead to a more fulfilling school life, workplace life, because someone's cared about you. Whereas if you're a victim of abuse and you see passive bystanders, your trauma is compounded because no one cares about you. And I think, yeah.
Well, absolutely. And I also think it's worse for the victim. And it's also the case where all of the other people who have not acted, it haunts them. I mean, people regularly talk about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I wish I had. And so what more powerful thing than to equip people with the ability to not have that sense of regret or responsibility about what they should have done.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And, just one last question for me, what's next for you and your research, and what more knowledge is out there that we can use to really help the moral rebel, help develop the moral rebel?
So, I love this opportunity. I'm so thankful for you for inviting me to talk, because here's the thing. I think that we all experience times in which we wish we could have acted, or times in which, we wish somebody would have acted, whether it's, we're the person who's being victimized or some way. It happens all the time, as we saw, last week in a train in Philadelphia, as you've just described, the reports of the problematic police officer in the UK, who now colleagues are sort of retrospectively thinking, oh, maybe I should have spoken up. And so to me, I think talking about the bystander effect, talking about how the fact that it's not in fact inevitable, we can look at how cultures change. So I think, very clearly of examples within our own lives about how things have changed. So I'm 52, and I share this example with my students, who again are like flabbergasted with this example. But I remember when I was a child, when you flew on an airplane, you would buy a ticket that could be in the smoking section or the non-smoking section. So some people listening to this now are like, what is she talking about? But do you remember that? Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah. So, okay, now you've dated how old you are. But here's the thing. But you say that now and people are like, what do you mean you could smoke on an airplane? You can't smoke on an airplane. But that's an example about how culture has changed. Something that we think now is crazy, is very commonplace. I remember getting my first cell phone that could maybe call people from the car. And now, you can buy a dress, shoot a movie, read a book on your phone. And so we can all think about ways in which culture has changed. And you know what? Culture can change in terms of bystanders. We could, in fact, create a culture of moral rebels in which the bystander effect is this old thing in the past that we think about, smoking on an airplane, because it's over. It doesn't happen anymore because we've created a society of moral rebels. And that's what I'm hoping my book and these conversations will help us spark. Because here's the thing, we all want to live in a world in which there are moral rebels all around us. So it's not our kid who lies unconscious in a dorm room for 19 hours. It's not, our daughter or sister or wife who was murdered by a police officer who had problematic, history in their past, right?
Yeah. I often think about, I started talking about the story of James in that prison who was there for 25 years. And he said to me, if one person had done something, I wouldn't be here. And, James has got a son who he's hardly ever seen. And for me, these moral rebels could have supported, James to see more of his son. I suppose that in many ways that's what we're saying here. I like to think that as well. I often say to groups, imagine a society where people knew what to look for, knew what to do. That'd be pretty cool. It'd be quite a cool society for all of us to think about. So for people watching this, thank you, Catherine, for speaking to me. I just wanted to get you in this room, have a conversation. You've inspired me through your research. You've just reassured me, to keep moving forward in this work. And you're right. When we present evidence around inaction, we can help people be more active. And that's what it's about.
Well, and you're doing that work on the ground, every day. And I so appreciate it, because again, that's the world we want to live in. And the bystander effect is not, in fact, inevitable. We can all learn to train our inner moral rebel, and we can practice those skills, and we can create a different reality.
Great. That's a great message to end on, I think. So thank you, folks, for tuning into this session with myself and Graham Goulden and Catherine Sanderson. And thank you again for my POV for allowing us to do this. Thank you.